Hi everyone, I'm Glenn Deason, and today is the 13th of February 2025, and I'm joined by the excellent Douglas Macgregor, Colonel in the US Army. Really great to see you again, Colonel.
Good to see you as well, Glenn.
So I first wanted to ask you what we can make of Trump's overall foreign policy. I mean, are we looking at a retrenchment to save cost, or reprioritizing towards the Western Hemisphere and Asia? Is it an effort to create a greater Israel or to get out of the Middle East? Is he trying to make up with Russia? It's because of his style, which is seemed to be improvising at time. He seems to be little bit all over the place. I was curious how you would assess his first 3 weeks in office.
Well, I think that's that's not an inaccurate characterization. Let me say as a preface to my remarks that I and millions of Americans are very happy with what he's doing here inside the United States. He's moving in some very important directions, questioning the status quo in terms of all the massive bureaucracy that we've developed over the last 80 years. So I think he's on the right track there. He's dealing now with the border and the criminality and the illegal human trafficking and so forth. But on the foreign policy side and defense wise, I think you're right. There is a certain amount of confusion and it's a certain amount of chaos that comes as a result of sometimes contradictory statements. So I think there is some good news. The good news is that for the first time, President Trump and President Putin actually spoke to each other on the phone. There had been a couple of communications previously, but always through an intermediary. This time they spoke directly. And President Putin invited President Trump to come to Moscow. The other thing is that President Trump has made it very clear that the borders are going to change, that there will be no reversal of Russian gains on the ground. What the Russians have, they're going to keep. And I think that's a very positive development. On the other hand, there have been some rather strange statements that don't make any sense at all. He wants to continue aid to Ukraine, in return for which he expects to be paid back in rare earths and potentially oil. That's going to be very difficult since the rare earths are under the feet of Russians in the Donbass, not Ukrainians. And I think the oil is there in the Black Sea, but I don't know how developed it is and how many rigs they've got and how much they're going to pump in terms of barrels. I have no idea. But that's a bit bizarre when you stop and think that thanks to us, there are more than 1 million dead Ukrainians because we are the ones that pushed them to war. We armed them. We installed the government that led them into war with Russia on the assumption first that we could defeat Russia with this proxy force. And when it became clear that was an impossibility, to supposedly weaken Russia. And then I'm hearing people say, well, he wants to keep this sort of thing up as leverage in his negotiations with President Putin. Well, that's a very dumb idea because we have no leverage, none. And the differences in interest are profound. As you know, Ukraine is an existential matter for Russia. It plays no such role for us or NATO. Never has. So why would the Russians be willing to compromise much beyond what we've heard thus far that they've said and allow, non-NATO or non-American troops into Ukraine? I don't see that happening. I don't see any kind of demilitarized zone. I don't see anything remotely like that. So I don't know what he expects to get and what leverage he thinks he's got. I would think if he's thinking strategically at all, that he would want to put an end to this hostility with Russia, period, and bury the hatchet, as we say, and get on with business because we need Russia's goodwill in many parts of the world. We would like to have their cooperation. But instead of that, I'm listening to this statement that he made yesterday. We can't allow Putin to win. Well, it's a little late in the game. He's won. And if you don't understand how serious Ukraine is strategically to Russia, then stand by because the Russians will not necessarily stop at the Dnieper River. They can go further. And this is something he needs to understand, and we need to get out of this. But at the same time, he's talking about the Europeans paying more money, which is very unlikely for their own defense. And I think he knows privately that very few people in Europe are going to do anything to defend themselves until we leave. And that was once his goal, to reduce our presence and eventually get out of the business of being Europe's first responder. So that's confusing. And then yesterday, there was a statement by him that he's considering withdrawing our forces from the South China Sea, which is fine. I don't think we need any forces in Asia at all. But then again, I don't regard China as an imminent military threat. So that's something we should welcome. Put an end to this nonsense about Taiwan. There's no reason for us to go to war over Taiwan. Taiwan has no particular strategic importance to us, but it's vital to China. We should respect that. So hopefully we'll work through some of this confusion. But I don't know. I mean, Glenn, I must confess that, like you, I'm a little confused.
Well, I think it's easy from the negotiation style of Trump. He seems to be looking to make as much noise as possible in order to give himself some space to maneuver. Or at times, I'm wondering if it's all strategy behind there, or other times I think maybe he's just again improvising. So I'm hoping there's someone behind the wheel, of course. But in terms of how much time is left for in Ukraine, because again the options here, as you mentioned, there's a limited leverage. Not only the NATO doesn't have that much weapons to send, even if you would want to, and the Ukrainians are struggling now with manpower. How do you see the situation on the ground in Ukraine? It seems to have been unraveling a bit since the summertime, but is it intensifying? Because you get almost impression, at least looking from the map, that the villages are falling faster. But given that this is a war of attrition, how do you measure and how do you see the development of the war on the ground at the moment?
I think the Russians will continue to advance incrementally until they reach the Dnieper River. And then they'll make a decision based upon what they learn from President Trump regarding how much further they go. They're certainly not going to tolerate the government in Kiev that exists today. I certainly wouldn't. How can you negotiate with this man, Zelensky? It's absurd. He's been lying his way through the last 3 years about everything. He's a criminal. He's crooked. How many bank accounts has he got that is full of American dollars that he's pilfered, along with all of his friends and oligarchs? So I don't see anything good happening there. I think the Russians will achieve their aims. They will ultimately denazify, demilitarize, and neutralize Ukraine. That's going to happen. And it's a question of how fast they want to do it, and that's going to depend upon us. So that's part of what we cannot be certain of right now, except that no one is going to dislodge the Russians. We're not going to commit any forces to do that, neither will the Europeans. And usually when you're in this kind of situation, you shut up and make a deal, as we say. And of course, that was Napoleon's famous remark about the Pope. The Pope objected to what he was doing. He turned around and said, "Well, how many battalions has the Pope got?" And the answer was obvious: none. So the hell with the Pope. So I think we need to understand that we're dealing with a very different situation. The other one that is open that we didn't talk about, of course, is the Middle East. And President Trump wants to be transactional financially everywhere but in the Middle East. He seems to be quite willing to continue to fund the Israelis. He's now said that Israel will annex the West Bank. And he seems to be prepared to watch the Israelis annihilate whatever is still in Gaza in the near future when this ceasefire, which was really never meant to go beyond the first phase, frankly, finally comes to an end. He said he's going to unleash hell. Well, if you're in Gaza, I don't know what else you can do at this point. You've already been through hell, so that means more hell. And I don't know how much attention we are paying to the rest of the world, let alone the rest of the Middle East. Now, we know that the Turkish foreign minister and the Turkish head of intelligence was recently in Tehran. They're now in Riyadh. I don't know if they're still there. I'll be very interested in where they go next. Where they go next will tell us a lot about where the region is headed. especially if they go to Cairo. The entire region is livid with rage and anger. And that's the place where we are very close to the outbreak of a major regional war. I don't think everyone is going to sit quietly and be easily bullied by us or the Israelis into submission while the Israelis kill another several 100,000 Palestinians and begin ethnic cleansing on the West Bank. I don't know if President Trump realizes that. And again, going back to Russia, Russia is going to stand by Iran. And I'm sure you're aware the Washington Post blurted out something that we all know, which is that the Israelis are probably going to attack Iran in the near future. They said in the next few months. I've always anticipated it in March or April. And Iran is very well organized and prepared for it. And I think the Israelis will go it alone now that we've given them this enormous stock of munitions. And I think it won't work. And if it works badly, which it could, there'll be tremendous pressure on us to come in and bail out the Israelis, if not reinforce them. So, we're not going to get much goodwill out of the Russians if we go to Moscow and insist that we win and they lose, which is kind of a dumb position to take on the whole thing.
Yeah, this is this maximum pressure. It seems to work some places, but not obviously in others. For example, it could make the Colombians change their minds. It could get some deals on the Panama Canal. It's probably going to be able to bully the Europeans into getting some good base deals in Greenland. But with the Russians, when it's an issue of existential threat, and also when, as you said, there's no leverage, it's very strange when he talks about the weakness of their economy and 1 million dead soldiers, which is a very strange number to come with. But also putting sanctions on uranium, this would to the United States, this would be a great exercise in self-harm, it would seem. But especially now with the Middle East, I think, is it possible that he's merely trying to get a good deal out of the Iranians or shake up the region? But is Netanyahu leading? Is he leading Netanyahu, or is Netanyahu, getting the better of him in terms of setting him up for a conflict with Iran? Then, because I don't doubt that he thinks he's in control, but it's hard to get clarity around this. And also, what is Trump gonna look like if he already set a clock ticking? Was it at Saturday he was gonna unleash hell on Gaza? Was it?
Yes.
So
Supposedly, I don't know what that means. We're all waiting to find out. Uh, I cannot imagine that we would join a bombing campaign directed at the people on the ground in Gaza. That's incomprehensible to me. But then again, I suppose it's possible. I simply think the Israelis, now that they have all the 2,000-pound bombs that they can drop, along with these very large bunker busters, which have the same impact as a 10-kiloton warhead, those they think are designed for Iran. I just don't know how they're going to deliver those, because you usually need a very large and powerful bomber like the B-2 to carry that kind of weight. I don't know that the Iranian or the Israelis have any bombers per se. So I don't know what they're going to do. The problem I see is this sort of bribe, bully, bomb approach to American foreign policy should end. We had voted for President Trump, many of us, because in addition to what he's doing domestically, we looked for what you mentioned at the beginning, disengagement from these conflicts and retrenchment, because we badly need it. But thus far, it doesn't look like that's where we're headed.
how do you see the wider region, though, in the Middle East that is responding to this new, well, I guess it's not new, but this, threats by Trump? Again, even if it's just negotiation tactics, suggesting that he's going to cleanse all of Gaza from every single Palestinian and then own Gaza, guessing making it Russian, sorry, American territory, somehow almost merging it with Israel. This can't be very popular in the region. Have you seen any pushback or consequences of this yet, or how do you see this situation developing?
Well, I think it's been universally rejected by everyone in the region. General Sisi was in Washington and made that abundantly clear they want nothing to do with it. They've committed their forces in Sinai. They're sitting across from Gaza and the Israeli border. The king of Jordan, after what appears to have been some vacillation, has now said that if they push refugees, Palestinian refugees, into Jordan, he will declare war on Israel. Then, of course, you have the Turks. They're horrified. And Erdogan has said this is unacceptable. Tehran obviously doesn't support it. The Emirates don't support it. And most important, I guess, from the Sunni standpoint, is that the Saudis have been unambiguous in their opposition. Now, all of us have asked the question, where did this come from? And now I'm seeing a lot of evidence from people that suggest that his President Trump's son-in-law was the originator of this dumb idea of essentially eliminating the people in Gaza. Although I don't think that's a unique idea in Israel. I think that's been under consideration for a long time. But the point is that there are such things as morality and law. All we're seeing is transactional action. You do this for us, we do this for you. You don't do this for us, we bomb you. You reimburse us, you compensate us financially, or we leave. This sort of business. I don't see that leading anywhere useful at this point. So I don't know if they're going to walk it back and say, well, we were just kidding. We didn't mean all of that. I don't know. We'll have to see what happens when the ceasefire ends. And I do think that regardless of what President Trump says, Mr. Netanyahu is in charge. And he's going to make decisions on the basis of what he thinks is in his interest and Israel's interest and in the interest of his agents in the United States. I think that means war in Gaza, ultimately the West Bank, and potentially sooner rather than later against Iran. There is no incentive to wait if you're an Israeli and you look at Iran. Your assumption is, right or wrong, they are on their way to a nuclear weapon. And I remember we've been listening to old statements by Netanyahu and others. They say, well, Iran's 6 months from a nuclear weapon. That was 2 or 3 years ago. Iran is 6 weeks from a nuclear weapon. That was a month or two ago. So if you're serious, you have to attack. If you attack Iran, all bets are off. The whole region will be inflamed and explode. And the Turks, as I said before, people need to pay attention not only to what Mr. Erdogan says, but what he does. And his population is galvanized, ready to fight. And he's got the capability, the force, but he doesn't want to fight us. We don't want to fight him. So what do we do under those circumstances if this entire region comes apart and descends upon Israel? I don't know.
Yeah, this is where the region gets more confusing as well, because for Turkey, the new jihadi government in Syria appears to be, of course, their proxy. But they seem to have a very, very different relationship with Israel. They seem to almost excuse when they drop bombs on the military warehouses in their part, well, in their region. So I'm just yes, I was wondering how you see this. Is this are they simply consolidating power? Are they aligning themselves with Israel, or do you see this this government with Turkey unavoidably getting into conflict with Israel, especially as it expanded so far into Syrian territory? Or is it stable at all? We don't hear much about it anymore these days.
Well, I think Jolani has been advised by some Chechens that are working with him on behalf of Putin to repair relations with the Russians. So the Russians are staying. So they still have an interest in Syria, and they are going to be involved in some way. And Erdogan has made it very clear to Jolani the Russians stay. Now, you just brought something else up. Erdogan has already said that the Israelis who are in Syria need to get out. The Israelis aren't going to leave voluntarily. And remember, all of this is in close proximity to Damascus. And Damascus is a very important site in Islam and to the Turks. So I'm sure Erdogan will eventually visit Damascus and pray in the Umayyad Mosque. Then there are discussions about Al-Aqsa. There are people that think that Al-Aqsa could be demolished by the Israelis so that they can press ahead with their building of this temple. And at the same time, you've got people in the Arab world who are claiming that the Arabs have purchased real estate, Emirates or Saudis or somebody and are working with the Israelis. It's very confused. It's very dangerous. And these things are out of control. I don't know that President Trump can single-handedly get control of what's going on there anymore. I think it's we have this expression, the horse has left the barn. How do you get the horse back in it? I think the horse is out there. It's left. So I think a war inevitably will break out between the Turks and Israel. The question is when. Not any sooner than absolutely necessary, because Erdogan has much to do. He has larger fish to fry. Remember, he claims most of northern Iraq as part of Turkey. And it was for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. This is the Ottoman Empire. So is Syria. So he's going to move cautiously. He doesn't want to put his enterprise at risk, but he will fight. And at the same time, the Iranians are not interested in going to war, but they're ready. And they have a lot of capability now, and the Russians have helped them enormously over the last 6 months. And Russia will not sit by idly. Then you have the Chinese. They've increased the size of their naval flotilla in the Indian Ocean, but they're going to do everything in their power to ensure the Straits of Hormuz stay open, because they depend upon access to those straits. So I don't know how that works out if those straits should become blocked for some reason, or the oil facilities in Iran are destroyed as a result. There's so much that can go wrong at this point, Glenn. It's hard to estimate. And then we do see a lot of evidence for the Israelis working closely with the Greeks. And the Greeks seem to be prepared for a war with the Turks. And there are people suggesting that it is Israeli strategy to unleash the Greeks against the Turks if the Turks turn on them. So we have a recipe here for disaster. And I don't think anybody's thinking it through carefully right now in Washington. And we haven't even talked about Egypt. And of course, the Egyptians don't trust the Turks. They're worried about the Muslim Brotherhood. Neither do the Jordanians. They see that as a pernicious, mendacious influence, the Muslim Brotherhood. And Mr. Erdogan is the man who leads the Muslim Brotherhood in the region. I mean, all of these things are sort of milling around in this pot of discontent. So at this stage, almost anything is possible.
And as all of this is happening, one gets the impression that the Europeans have become mere spectators. They don't seem like they have much of a role in that region either. But I guess that also applies to the conflict in Ukraine with the European studies, because they seem to have lost all the influence they used to have. And we just saw now the U.S. Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, make these statements that in a settlement that it would have to be realistic, that Ukraine would not get NATO membership. It would be unlikely to get its territory back. And also in any security guarantees, the United States wants to sit this out. That is also not to get NATO involved. And they finished it all off by saying that, the US also would no longer be primarily focused on European security. So you can imagine the panic going around in Europe, where they can't imagine, life without being led by the United States. How do you
Well, you
see
have
this
to,
situation?
keep in mind, Glenn, keep in mind, this is not news. This was President Trump's intent when he was in office. And I happen to strongly support him. I don't think the Europeans will regain their self-confidence and become a major power in the world again until they accept responsibility for their own defense. And I think that's a good thing. You've got governments coming to power now that are nationalists. These nationalists are not warmongers. The people leaving office and being thrown out. I mean, the Germans have an election on 23 February. I'll be very interested to see how that turns out. Everyone rejects the AfD. Well, the AfD is getting steadily stronger and stronger and stronger, because Germans are saying, what's wrong with the AfD? What they're saying is, we want to be out of the EU. We want to be out of NATO. We don't want to be dragged into any wars. We want to pursue German national strategic interest. Well, that's a good thing if you're a German. You're hearing some of the same things elsewhere in Europe, certainly in Slovakia, in Hungary, in Austria. So this is healthy. And I think all of this is going to change the situation for the best, That's why I think that President Trump ought to take advantage of it and back out. In other words, end the aid, pull us out of Ukraine, and then tell the Europeans and the Russians, we will support whatever solution you come up with. We agree to neutrality. I've always said Austrian neutrality, which I still think is the right model. It's one with which the Russians are familiar. So that would be a good thing. The Europeans need to sign up for that and get past all this nonsense. The problem is we still have people that want to meddle there, and they'll say, "Well, you're in retreat. You're in America. You're not an America first guy because you don't want to dominate." Well, I am an America first person because I don't want to dominate. I want to dominate at home, and that's why I said at the beginning of this, I support what President Trump is doing here in the United States. I think that should be our priority. I think privately he does too, but I think he's being pulled into certain events and places by the people that hijacked our government a long time ago. And it's been a disaster. We need to cut our losses and get out of these places. And we should look for some solution. It may not be perfect, but any solution that prevents this Armageddon from occurring in the Middle East. That's not in anyone's interest. And I'm very, very happy to hear what he said about demilitarizing our relationship with China. There's no reason for it. And that effectively, that's what he's implying by pulling forces out of Southeast Asia or South China Sea and other places. We need to get out. So, Glenn, I don't know what we will do. I think we will do what Churchill said. Americans eventually do the right thing after they've done everything else. I think that may happen here too. But the everything else right now is very dangerous in the Middle East.
No, I agree. And I saw the British, they said, well, if the Americans leave Ukraine, we will take over, carry the weight. But I'm not sure. On the well, I guess
Well,
that's all.
that's very entertaining.
Yeah. No,
And I
it's
guess they're going to tap into the Norwegian National Sovereign Fund to pay for it because the British economy is failing badly. Their financial system is on the verge of collapse. Starmer's days are numbered. I'm surprised he's still there. I don't think he'll be there much longer. The British people, I think, are increasingly fed up as well.
But yeah, so this Sweden come out and say, no, no, it's not over yet. They can still become a part of NATO in the future. They're still clinging on to this. But as you suggested, if the US is shifting its focus, yeah, would like to get out of there simply out of necessity. What do you see this means for NATO in the future? Because you have a lot of components there. That is the US leaving a bit. You have the new, more nationalist governments coming in Europe, which aren't that interested in fighting a war with Russia. So, if you're gonna again look into a crystal ball, what do you see happening with NATO as the main, yeah, security institution of Europe?
NATO should have been Europeanized in 1992. In other words, when the Soviet state fell apart and the Warsaw Pact was out of business and Germany was reunited, there was no real requirement for NATO. And if you go back to that time, you remember all the luminaries in Washington and their globalist friends in Europe running around saying, well, if NATO isn't out of area, it's out of business. So they began looking for places where they could intervene militarily. I think that's been a disaster for 30 plus years. I don't think it's something the Europeans want, and I know Americans don't want it. So I think from that standpoint, NATO should have gone away. I think it will. The question is how? Will it go out with a bang or a whimper? And if the Germans elect a nationalist government that says we've had it with NATO, then we're out. We need to get out of Germany. We should have gotten out of there in the mid to late 90s. It's just this great myth that if we're not there holding everybody's hand or holding them by the throat, that there will be wars and conflict and disaster. Well, that doesn't hold up to closer scrutiny. We live in the 21st century. I don't see any interest in Germany or France or Spain or Poland in invading anybody else around them. I just don't see it. There will be disputes, but I think we've reached a point now where those could be handled without large numbers of casualties on both sides. So I don't sign up for that notion that we have to be everywhere, but that's still very strongly held belief by many in Washington. You've heard them on the Senate floor. Lindsey Graham. They keep looking for someone else to bomb, frankly. Open up a new war, open up a new front, keep us engaged no matter what. Well, I think it needs to end, and I think it's going to end first in Europe. It should also end in Asia. The last place it will end is the Middle East because there's a lot of money behind the United States government right now, influencing politicians to make them do things that most Americans would never do.
Well, I think the weakness is you're approaching this from a position of reason. I think in Europe they still believe the Russians are not just planning to invade the Baltic states, but they might come for Poland. So we've created a different universe for ourselves here, and it's quite absurd if you observe the actual discourse. Um, Anyways, I would have loved to ask you about Rubio's comment about the end of the unipolar world order, but I'm afraid we ran out of time. So.
Well, look, Rubio isn't telling anybody anything we don't already know. So that's a blinding flash of the obvious. And by the way, you mentioned Greenland and Panama and so forth. There is no Chinese seizure of the Panama Canal. That's a lot of nonsense. You have a firm outside of Hong Kong. It's come out of Hong Kong. They're contractors, and they have operated either end of the canal to help with loading and offloading ships and to do some infrastructure work. They were hired by the Panamanian government. They were hired by the Panamanian government from Hong Kong because we wouldn't take the contract in the United States. So it's very simple. If you're worried about these Chinese loading and unloading ships at either end, call Hong Kong, buy out the contract, and send the Americans down there to do it. It's that simple. So this is all nonsense about Panama. The other thing, somebody said, well, we have to get our aircraft carriers through there to defend Taiwan. Well, good luck with that. Aircraft carriers don't fit through the Panama Canal. That was built for battleships back in the early 20th century. It's one of the reasons our battleships were narrower in terms of the beam than the battleships built by Germans, Japanese, and Brits. But you're not going to get anything through the canal that's life or death for anything in the Pacific. So I think that needs just to be dropped and go away. The other part is Greenland. And, as I've said, I think we've talked about this. The Danes are allies. You're telling me that the Danes are suddenly now hostile and we have to invade Greenland? This is nonsense. And we've controlled everything along the Arctic periphery in Canada, Greenland, Alaska, even your country. The periphery is under our surveillance and reconnaissance and capability umbrella, if you will. What do we need to do that we're not already doing? It's rather stupid. Again, that's an opportunity for discussions with the Russians who control much of the other periphery so that we don't have any problems, that we can use it. Everybody can use it. Chinese, Thais, Japanese, anybody to use this thing. And that ought to be our goal. So I think we ought to stop talking about everything in military terms because it just doesn't fit. But, as you say, I'm just too, I'm a victim of reason and I need to emote more like everybody in Washington.
I guess this is a problem of having a empire not based on the geoeconomics anymore, but military. Because, as they say, when all you have is the hammer, everything is a nail. I thought it was also a strange military approach to, restoring some more influence over the Panama Canal. It's certainly this was, or Greenland for that sake, that's in threatening to take it by military force. It seems really not to be the best tool for the job as it is. But
well, remember, we have a club here in the United States, and that club is called the Bombs Away Club. And whenever you talk about the use of military, the power, American military, they all cheer, hooray, hooray, thinking that destruction and bombing demonstrates our greatness to the world. Well, we've demonstrated something to everybody in the Middle East, and that is our callous disregard for human life. And that's got to stop. There is such a thing as morality, and there is such a thing as law. Now, we have nothing but contempt for international law. Law is what we say it is. But the truth is that's not quite right. And this is going to get us into a lot of trouble because everybody knows that without us, nothing would have happened in Gaza.
well, I really appreciate your time. So I exceeded a little bit. So, but thanks again, Colonel.
Okay.
I really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you, Glenn.
Thanks.